reincarnation, past lives, the idea that a soul returns carrying memories, languages, emotions and knowledge that was never taught in this lifetime. Weird World has covered remarkable cases before, but the 4 stories in this episode push the boundaries of what most people are willing to consider possible. A Swedish girl who navigated Amsterdam's backstreets without a map. A woman who spoke fluent German under hypnosis without ever having learned it. A child who recognised his widow. A scholar who wept at a doorway he swore he'd walked through before. These are 4 astonishing reincarnation cases that researchers, psychiatrists, and even skeptics have struggled to explain away. The following fascinating case of reincarnation was told by a professional couple who did not want their names mentioned for fear of ridicule. The father was a famous author, and he and his wife also ran seminars across the whole of the United States. The couple had a son called Michael, and when he was a baby, showed a lot of interest in his father's Rolex watch and always wanted to hold it. The child was persistent in his efforts and continued to reach for the watch. One day when Michael was starting to utter his first words, he pointed to the watch and said, "Mine." On another occasion, when his parents called him by his name, he then pointed to himself and said, "Sonny." From that moment onwards, he insisted that his name was not Michael, but Sonny, and his parents eventually stopped calling him Michael and agreed to call him Sonny. As the months passed and his vocabulary started to improve, he said to his parents, "Me, Sonny Ray." His mother thought he was just joining up words and was forming the word Sunray. However, agreeing to her son's insistence on being called Sonny, from that moment on she started to call her son My Little Sunray. The surprises never stopped coming when one day he told his parents that he had a wife and her name was Dawn and they'd lived in Texas. The parents would normally listen to classical music, but on one occasion there was a country and western song playing on the radio, and to their utter amazement, he would not only sing along to the music, but he actually knew the words. On another occasion, he was sitting with his mother looking at a book that had pictures of dogs, and their son screamed out excitedly, "That's my dog Willie!" At this stage, the parents were starting to look at each other, wondering why their son was coming out with strange comments, with equally strange behaviour, but never for a second did they consider that he could be talking about living a previous life. But things got even weirder for the couple when their son was 7 years old, and they were running a seminar in Texas. It just so happens that one of the people that was to take part in the seminar was a woman called Dawn Ray. It was during the break that Michael's father took the opportunity to have a conversation with the woman and ask her whether she was married. She replied that she'd been a widow for 8 years. He then asked her what her husband's first name was, and she said, Sonny. The couple could only look at each other aghast, and then asked the woman whether she was able to accompany them to their hotel room after the seminar, as they had something important they wanted to discuss with her. After the woman arrived at the hotel and came to their room, they told her that they have a son who claimed that he'd been married to a woman called Dawn Ray from Texas in a previous life. To seek further confirmation, they then asked whether she owns or had owned a white spaniel. Dawn Ray said, "Oh yes, that was Willie," and he and Sonny were virtually inseparable. After hearing the amazing story that the couple had just told her, she was determined to meet Michael, so the couple arranged for the 7-year-old son to fly down to Texas to meet up with the woman. When they called their son, they did not tell him why they wanted him to come down to join them. 2 days later, Michael arrived at the airport and after collecting him, took him directly to Dawn Ray's house. When they arrived at the house and the woman opened the door, Michael excitedly called out, "Dawn!" and stretched out his hands and ran into the arms of a bewildered-looking Mrs. Ray. He then hugged her and gave her a big kiss on the cheek. After the initial shock and introduction, everyone made their way into the living room. Mrs. Ray could not quite believe what had just happened and was initially sceptical. She then asked Michael whether he was familiar with the house they were now in, but Michael said he did not recognise it. But it was not surprising that he didn't recognise the house because she only moved into the house after the death of her husband Sonny. Michael then asked her whether she had kept his guitar, and after a look of astonishment went to the cupboard and took out the guitar, which she then placed into the outstretched arms of the young boy. Michael then held the guitar in a way that showed he was familiar with the instrument. More surprises were in store, when even though the fretboard was a bit too large for Michael to hold properly, he was still able to strum and sing a well-known folk song, which amazed his parents, because he'd never ever played the guitar in his life, and how did he know what to do, and how did he know the old folk tune? Instead of Mrs. Ray, he was now addressing her as Dawn. He then asked her whether she'd kept his watch. Mrs. Ray then left the room and returned with a box that contained the watch. When he opened the box, he found a Rolex watch that was identical to the one that his father was wearing. Michael then asked for his camera, but first they asked their son to describe the camera. After describing the camera, Mrs. Ray again left the room and came back with a camera that perfectly matched Michael's description. Michael then inquired about his pipe, which he again was able to perfectly describe. Later, in an even stranger twist of events, Dawn Ray sold a house in Texas and moved in with a family in California. She would babysit Michael whenever his parents were travelling, which was quite often. When Michael was 14, Dawn Ray moved to New York, but Michael missed her so much that his parents allowed him to live with her in New York, and they still lived together. This is a very strange incident, and you have to question the reasoning behind reincarnation. My personal belief in reincarnation is that with every incarnation that you have, I presume you also progress as a spirit. But what progress did Michael's spirit learn in his new life when all he did was return to his previous life and continue where he left off, living with the same woman he'd left after he died and was reincarnated? If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. The following case is about a man called Peter Avery, who was born in Derby, England, on May the 15th, 1923. In World War II, Peter Avery served in the Royal Indian Navy, and after the war attended the University of London, where he graduated in 1949 with a degree in Arabic and Persian languages. After university, Peter Avery became employed as the training manager for Arabic and Persian languages for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and was stationed in the city of Amsterdam in the southwest of Iran. After his assignment at Amsterdam and the surrounding oil fields, where he worked from 1949 to 1950, he returned to England, where he became manager of the company's London office. A man by the name of John Evans then approached the organisation, telling them that he planned to travel to Iran and needed an interpreter, so Peter Avery was assigned the job to assist Mr. Evans on his trip to Isfahan in central Iran. Peter was overjoyed at the prospect he had been assigned to, as it would give him a chance to see more of Iran, as it had previously been restricted to Abadan and the surrounding areas. When Peter Avery and John Evans arrived in Isfahan, the following morning they had breakfast where Peter outlined to John Evans the route they would be taking from their hotel to the city's bazaar. Then Maidan-e-Shah and a public square built by Shah Abbas in the late 16th century. John Evans was amazed at Peter Avery's detailed knowledge of the streets of Isfahan, given the facts that he'd never been there in his life. Peter was actually surprised himself, as he seemed to know the way to the various locations in the city without the use of a map or a guidebook. He just seemed to know the way. How was he able to do that? As the men were walking along the various streets, Peter's directions were extremely accurate as he led John Evans through the streets of Isfahan to the bazaar and Maidan-e-Shah. The final location that Peter Avery took John Evans to that morning was a place called Madrasa Maidan-e-Shah, which was a theological complex built by Shah Sultan Hussein in 1706 that he dedicated to his mother. In the garden of the complex was a blue dome mosque, and the moment the two men walked into the courtyard, Peter Avery became extremely emotional and burst into uncontrollable sobbing and had an overwhelming feeling that he had come home. He sat on the side of a pond while John Evans decided to leave him by himself, as he could plainly see that he was very emotional on arriving there. After composing himself, he again met up with John Evans, where both men remained quiet, with Peter Avery feeling embarrassed by his sudden emotional outburst, but at the same time, John Evans was surprisingly understanding about the incident. That morning, Peter Avery had felt a strange familiarity with the city and its surrounding geography, yet it was a place that he'd never ever visited before. However, it was not the first time that Peter Avery had experienced what seemed to be a previous life in Iran and that part of the world. In 1944, when Peter was 21 and serving in the Royal Indian Navy during World War II, an Indian officer on the ship had invited Peter to visit his family, who lived in Lahore, which is now part of Pakistan. The officer knew of Peter's interest in Islamic literature and culture and wanted Peter to meet his father, Khan Bahadur Muhammad Shafti, who lectured on Asian studies and was a scholar of Islamic history. In Lahore, they visited the Shalimar Bagh, a garden complex built by the Islamic Mughal emperors. Peter was accompanied by his friend's father, Shafi. Peter had never been to Shalimar Bagh before and knew nothing of its layout. Peter and Mr. Shafi entered the building through a doorway in a surrounding wall, and Peter somehow knew that this was not the original entrance. He told Mr. Shafi that the original doorway was in the wall opposite them on the other side of the enclosure. Mr. Shafi told Peter that he was correct. Peter also said that the small building in the centre of the garden was not part of the original design. Mr. Shafi verified his statement and said that the small building was originally part of an emperor's tomb complex and was moved to Ranjit Singh, a Sikh who ruled Lahore from 1799 to 1839. If Peter Avery had lived a past life where he appeared to be familiar with Shalimar Bagh, he must have lived there before 1799, before the small building was moved there. Peter Avery said that he'd had a sense of déjà vu on arriving at Shalimar Bagh in Lahore and had a feeling he'd been there before and knew the place intimately. He sensed he was returning and said that it felt like it had once been a home. But the feeling in Shalimar Bagh was nowhere near as emotional or intense as when he arrived in Madrasa in Isfahan along with his client John Evans. Had Peter Avery somehow remembered a past life or lives in Iran and Pakistan? From 1958 to 1990, Peter Avery was a university lecturer in Persian Studies at Cambridge University, and then continued as a Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, becoming a famous scholar of Persian Studies. Peter Avery is well known for his translations of Persian poets Hafiz and Omar Khayyam, and has written extensively on the history of Iran from its earliest origins to the present. Did Peter Avery's passion for Persia and Islamic studies come from a previous incarnation, as he had grown up in a totally different culture in England in a Christian environment? So where did he get his deep knowledge of the streets of Isfahan in Iran, along with the flood of emotions that he'd experienced in Madrasa Maida el-Shah in Isfahan, Iran? Unlike many other cases where people not only knew their environment they were visiting, but had remembered their names and the names of people around them, which could then be tracked down on records for proof of their past life. Unfortunately, Peter Avery was unable to remember any names of people from his past life, or for that matter, did not even remember his own name from his past life in Iran and Pakistan, so nothing could be historically validated. Yet he had an amazing knowledge of geographical locations, even though he had not previously visited in his current incarnation. Yet he was adamant that he did not gain any information through maps or books. Why did he experience a flood of emotions in Madrasa Maida el-Shah in Isfahan, Iran, with the overwhelming feeling that it seemed to have geographic memory? Was it the fact that he had once lived a life or lived in those locations? The reason he became fluent in Persian and would later become a well-known scholar in Persian and Islamic studies? Did his talent for the Persian language and love of Persian and Islamic literature and culture really stem from a past life in Iran? Peter Avery died on October 6, 2008 in England. The following story is another amazing case where a woman by the name of Barbro Karlen said that as a young girl, she told her parents she had lived another life with a different family in another country. Barbro Karlen was born in Sweden in 1954, and from a young age she did not feel part of her family. Barbro believed that she'd lived the life of another girl, but initially would not have realised who the girl was, because when she was born, Anne Frank's story would have been relatively unknown and had died at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp just 9 years before Barbro was born. At the time, nobody would have known about Anne Frank and her tragic story, as it was not published until 1947, initially in Dutch, and it would be several years before it would become a bestseller in other languages. However, Barbro continued to have vivid dreams and fear of uniforms. Her parents dismissed everything she said as childish imaginings. But her dreams and nightmares continued, and Barbro began to ask where her parents were, insisting that her current mother and father were not her real parents. She would ask the whereabouts of a girl called Margot, and other names of people where the family had no idea what she was talking about and had no answers for her. But records later showed that Margot was the older sister of Anne Frank, and Margot, like her sister, succumbed to spotted typhus in February 1945, tragically 2 months before the camp was liberated by British soldiers. As the years passed, Barbro continued to ask questions about her real family and was insistent in her belief that she was not Barbro, and her parents continued to doubt her story, that she was another person from another family, and that she would eventually grow out of it. They even took her to a psychiatrist who was unable to diagnose any problems with her. Barbro would not hear about the tragic story of Anne Frank, the Holocaust and concentration camps until the 1960s when she was at school. She did further research into Anne Frank and read her book for the first time and was amazed at how much they both had in common. They both enjoyed being outdoors, reading, and wanted to be writers. Their facial features were similar, and Barbro had similar fears related to Anne Frank's experiences, especially an aversion to men wearing uniforms. Whilst the classmates were hearing about the atrocities committed against the Jews, Barbro had come to the realization that she was Anne Frank, and when the teacher spoke about Anne Frank's life, she was talking about Anne and her family when they were in hiding, knowing that it had been her family. The fact that she now believed that she was Anne Frank in her previous life, Barbro felt it best she kept to herself and did not dare disclose any of her beliefs to her classmates for fear of being ridiculed. Barbro would become a writing protégé in school and believed that had Anne Frank lived, she too would have been successful. But Barbro's parents continued to doubt their daughter's belief that she was Anne Frank. But things would take a strange turn when the family decided to go on holiday to the Netherlands. When they arrived in Amsterdam, the family were initially lost, as Amsterdam is a difficult place to navigate for visitors. The family wanted to visit Anne Frank's house, and even though a local drew them a map, they still struggled to find the house. It was at this stage that Barbro said to her family that she knew how to get to the house. As the family had no other options left, decided to follow their daughter. Barbro then proceeded to take them through a maze of backstreets and various alleyways, and she appeared to know exactly where she was going. And within no time, they arrived at Anne Frank's house and found that it was now a museum. The family had never been to Amsterdam before, so how was their daughter able to traverse the many backstreets and alleyways so easily to get to the house? But this was just the beginning, and there would be other extraordinary moments that would eventually change her family's mind about their daughter's reincarnation belief that she'd lived the life of Anne Frank in her previous life. On arriving at the house, she noticed that the original steps were missing and remembered the exterior being different, and when inquiries were made, they were told that everything Barbro described was factual. Once inside, she felt terrified, and as they walked around the museum, she was able to relate to her family's stories that would not have been public knowledge. Barbro was both apprehensive and excited at the prospect of entering Anne Frank's bedroom, and as she walked into the actual room, was both disappointed and distraught on finding that the walls were bare, because the newspaper clippings of movie stars which had been placed on the walls as Anne Frank were missing. Her mother then asked the guy whether there had been any newspaper clippings on the wall, and was told that yes, there were clippings on the walls, but unfortunately visitors were touching them and even stealing them for souvenirs, so they had been taken down to be looked after and would eventually be placed in frames. However, for Barbro, to be in the building became too emotional, and she ran out in tears. The amount of evidence the family had received after visiting Anne Frank's museum was enough to convince her family that Barbro was telling the truth and was probably the reincarnation of Anne Frank, who had died of typhus in 1945 at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany, and had reincarnated 9 years later in 1954 as their daughter Barbro Karlen in Sweden. Barbro continued writing into adulthood and wrote a book about her experience in 2000 called And the Wolves Howled, Fragments of Two Lifetimes. Barbro also served as a mounted policewoman for the Swedish National Police Force. She went on many speaking engagements where she spoke about being the reincarnation of Anne Frank. She later met a cousin of Anne Frank's called Buddy Elias, who was initially skeptical about her claims. When he first met her, he did not disclose his identity, and after talking with her, he found there was an immediate connection and she knew things only the Frank family would have known. Barbro said that over time the memories have faded, but every so often still come back to her, and believed it was a life's work to do justice to Anne Frank's story, and she was even supported by the head of the Anne Frank Foundation. Unfortunately, Barbro Karlen passed away after a long illness on October the 12th, 2022. The following is another amazing reincarnation story about a woman called Dolores Jay, who was regressed to a past life claiming to be a girl called Gretchen Gottlieb, who lived in late 19th century Germany. Her husband, Carol Jay, was a Methodist minister from Ohio, who initially practiced hypnosis in the 1950s to help people with chronic pain. Then in the 1960s, he started experimenting with past life regression. His wife Dolores started getting back pain, so on May the 10th, 1970, he conducted a hypnosis session to help relieve her pain. Under hypnosis, he asked his wife, "Does your back hurt?" And she replied in German, "Nein," meaning no in German. Then on May the 13th, 1970, he again hypnotized his wife, who again replied in German, and this time just said, "Ich bin Gretchen," which means "I am Gretchen." Over the next few months, he held further hypnotic sessions where the woman, who called herself Gretchen, repeatedly came through speaking only in German. After 10 further sessions, Jay invited a German speaker to participate in a session, where the translator proceeded to have a conversation with Gretchen in German. On April 23rd, 1971, his wife wrote 40 words in German during the manifestation of Gretchen. It is interesting to note that when Dolores Jay wrote as Gretchen, her handwriting was totally different. It is also interesting to note that Dolores had never learned German and in her current life could not speak or even understand German. When a person can speak a language that was not learned through normal means, it is called xenoglossy, and is considered strong evidence of reincarnation. In conversations, Gretchen could understand German and English, but she'd only spoke in German. On September 2nd, 1971, Professor Ian Stevenson, the acclaimed Canadian psychiatrist at the University of Virginia School of Medicine, travelled to Mount Orab, Ohio, to participate in a session with Dolores Jay. It just so happened that Professor Stevenson could speak German and was able to converse with Dolores in German. Professor Stevenson would later include other German-speaking individuals to participate in the sessions. Under hypnosis, Gretchen came through and was able to have conversations with the German-speaking individuals, keeping in mind that Dolores Jay could not speak a word of German. On March 25th, 1974, Dolores Jay was invited to Professor Stevenson's laboratory at the University of Virginia, where Professor Stevenson and a colleague by the name of Elizabeth Day were able to have a conversation with Gretchen in German. Over a period of time spanning 19 sessions, where 6 of the sessions were recorded, and in that time, Dolores, or Gretchen, spoke 237 different German words and used 120 specific words before anyone else had said them, which showed that she was not just mimicking conversation. In one of the tape sessions, Gretchen introduced 96 German words that were not previously spoken by the interviewers, and 21 of which neither Gretchen or the interviewers had ever spoken before. Gretchen could converse in German in an interactive way. She could both understand and respond in German. Later, Professor Stevenson had 3 different German speakers sign statements validating that Dolores, or Gretchen, was really speaking German. Again, I repeat that Dolores Jay did not know German other than 9, which most Americans would have known. Ian Stevenson states that a language must be learned and practiced at some point in time. So, if a language was not learned in the current incarnation, then it must have been learned in a prior incarnation. Gretchen rarely spoke automatically and replied politely to questions in a polite manner. She said her full name was Gretchen Gottlieb, and she lived with a father whose name was Hermann, who was elderly with white hair. She sniggered when describing her father on a horse. Unfortunately, her mother Erika had died when Gretchen was only 8 years old, and she had no siblings. Her father was also the mayor of Eberswalde, Germany, where they lived, and they resided on the street called Birkenstrasse. Eberwald was a small town with a bakery, butcher shop, church, and college. There was a forest and a river outside the town. She also spoke of the cities of Worms and Wiesbaden. Gretchen said that a housekeeper by the name of Frau Schilder would come to their home to cook and clean. Frau Schilder would bring her own 4 children to her home, and she got to play with them. Gretchen said that she spent most of her time in the kitchen caring for the children, where the youngest was just 3 years old. Gretchen said that she never went to school, which was apparently normal for girls at that time, and that she could neither read nor write. She was Roman Catholic and knew that the Pope was the head of the church. She often showed fear when talking about the Bundesrat, which was a cabinet in Germany that was active from 1875 to 1900 and was powerful and had to approve all bills before they became law. When Gretchen spoke about the Bundesrat, Stevenson assumed that Gretchen had lived in the late 19th century in Germany when the Bundesrat was in existence. She said that she suffered from a serious illness and had severe headaches, and would put her hand to her head, making a facial expression, and was in great pain. Gretchen said that she died at the age of 16. In some sessions, Gretchen thought that she was speaking to interviewers on the street near her home, and would plead to the interviewers that she had to go home as her father would be upset if he found she was talking to strangers. Although Gretchen had told them that she died at the age of 16, it appears that she did not realise that she was actually dead. It seems that a soul can retain a past life personality intact. On February the 5th, 1974, Professor Stevenson had Dolores undergo a lie detector test, which she passed. In the test, she vouched that she had not learned or known German prior to Gretchen emerging under hypnosis. For further evidence that Dolores Jay was not faking it under hypnosis, Professor Stevenson even interviewed Dolores' parents, Boyd and Laura Skidmore, and her sister Mary, who all signed statements that no one in the family knew or spoke German, and that there were no German-speaking individuals in the area where she'd grown up. In order to confirm what Gretchen Gottlieb had said, Professor Stevenson looked for further evidence and found that the town of Eberswalde did exist, but there was no mayor by the name of Gottlieb on record, and he assumed that her father may have been a lesser official, or that Gretchen may have been an illegitimate daughter of a mayor of Eberswalde, and was given the name Gottlieb after her birth. Gretchen could also have been talking about a different town called Eberswalde, which had been incorporated into a larger city. Professor Stevenson worked with Carlin and Dolores Jay for several years and got to know them well, and became convinced that they were honest in their statements, that Dolores was a Christian where reincarnation conflicted with her beliefs. Her husband said that Dolores was bewildered and a little scared by her ability to speak German. Carol Jay also struggled with his wife's past life regressions, which made his life difficult as a Methodist Christian minister. On January the 20th, 1975, the Washington Post published a newspaper article about Dolores Jay's experience. When the local church community read the article, some accused them of dealing with the devil. Overall, Professor Ian Stevenson believed it to be a legitimate reincarnation case, and if reincarnation is indeed accepted as an explanation, it appears that the ability to speak a different language can be conveyed from one incarnation to another.